Peter Racy here, Legacy of Expo 88 podcast channel, and this podcast is an amalgam of 32 YouTubes that were recorded in 2020 and 2021 of Lawrie Smith talking to myself, Sallyanne Atkinson, Andrew Schulz and David Hinchliffe. The podcast is not an attempt to summarise the over 4 hours of interviews, but really is an inducement or a tease to entice you to go off and explore the 32 YouTubes that were recorded and really contain an amazing background information summary of Lawrie Smith's work during and for World Expo 88.
Yeah, Peter, it certainly was a very important process. I think it all began with the day that I was appointed to the position. I can still hear Sir Llew saying it to me. He said, "Look, I know you've been to a lot of expos, but this one here in Brisbane is going to be special, and I want it to be the greenest exposition ever. And I want it to be green and wonderful and colourful on the first day and on the final day and on every day between it for 6 months. Can you do it?" Without thinking, I said, "Yes, Sir Llew, no problem. Yeah, we can do that." Yeah, not really thinking that, we had, sort of 5 years, basically 5 years lead time to organise it. And we did it. Had a great team of people working together at Landplan, my company, and working with all of the other people who were involved with Expo. And certainly from the early days, it was basically that combined process between Jim McCormack, Graham Bly, the architects with us, and integrating it. That was the important thing, that it was all integrated together. And so with the Expo landscape, so often landscape is the last thing that's done, and it just becomes like the icing on the cake, and it's rather nebulous and really not of much consequence. But with World Expo 88, with Sir Llew's instruction to us, it had 3 parts in it, really. The first part was that we were going to present to the world in Brisbane a collection of the most diverse plant material from the various parts of the world, the participating nations where they came from, to demonstrate to the world that this was an international event being held in Australia to celebrate our bicentenary in 1988. Then the next thing was to have a network of unique Australian native plants that basically permeated right through the site, but came into major core collections at particular places like the Australia precinct and the Queensland precinct and others. And that was to demonstrate, how unique and wonderful the flora of Australia is, again, on the world stage. And so then the third section was the fact that it was being held here in southeast Queensland. So once again, we're going to focus on the incredible subtropical plants that we have here, and to create something very magical with those, particularly in the Queensland precinct. And the result of that was the epiphyte forest, which of course we can talk about later. And of course this was really the premier one, if you like, on the Expo site, because it was surrounding the Queensland Pavilion, and it was a very important node in the whole circulation system, because the main parade route went through it, the monorail went through it, there were 2 or 3 other circulation ways that all concentrated from that point. And of course it was the queuing space for people to go into the Queensland Pavilion. So I think that I wanted to say, what is the thing that it most typifies the Queensland environment for many people? And probably it's rainforest now, and the rainforest extends right up the east coast in little pockets here, there and everywhere. And once extensive, millennia ago, an extensive coverage of much of the subtropical and tropical areas. So as you said before, yes, well, how do you recreate a rainforest? That was the idea that I wanted to bring to people's understanding, that, the beauties of rainforests. So okay, thinking about it, I thought, well, the thing that is most obvious when you walk into a rainforest are the tree trunks that soar above you and around you, and they're all covered with orchids and vines and epiphytes and ferns and all sorts of wonderful life forms. And so I thought, well, that's what we've got to do it. Now, nature takes 1 million years or so to do that, but I only had 3-4 years. And so that's how the concept evolved. And to create this impression of walking through a rainforest and seeing the thing that is most dominant to anybody as they walk into a rainforest are those tree trunks that are just clothed in green.
But your vision started out at 10, 12, and then all of a sudden it suffered a major event called Truscott, and then it sort of blew out.
Yeah, great, yeah. No, look, that was fantastic. I mean, when John arrived, several years after we started work on it all, this was one of the things that he looked at and he said, that is fantastic, those 10 or 12 poles that you had there, but we're going to get some funds to that to increase it substantially, and he did. And so out of whatever budget, had enough to turn that into 60 poles, up to 16 metres high, to really create a rainforest experience that was sort of really world-shattering in many ways, because it had never been done before in this way. And the important thing was that with most of the things that we tried to do with Expo was to use the theme of the Expo, which was leisure in the age of technology. So I wanted to use technology to assist us to make the epiphyte forest as we all enjoyed it. And I wanted to incorporate those into the epiphyte forest, and because of where they grow in the rainforest, they're very sensitive to wind conditions, moisture, and even light. And so that meant that they had to have basically their own little greenhouse or glass house. And they're quite large. The plants I'm talking about are tassel ferns, and they weep down. They're very beautiful, and there were some very rare orchids and things that we had in there too. So when you're working on something like Expo, it's great. The world is your oyster, I suppose. And so inquiries were made about how we could find some glass spheres or something. We didn't quite know to start with, but anyway, we found that there was a manufacturer in Japan who made these glass spheres. For whatever reason they were used there, I'm not sure, but they were perfect for what we wanted. And so we ordered 3 of those, and they were 2 meters in diameter, these glass spheres. They weighed quite a lot because they were quite thick, and so they were brought out from Japan, and we had special locations for them, so that, as you can see behind me there, that they were at a level where you could actually look in and see these beautiful plants that were on display. And it was interesting, really, because there's other photos that I have when we were installing them. Being a 2-meter sphere of glass, the chaps from the nurseries who were installing it all had to get inside and arrange the plants attractively in the sphere, and so it was amazing to see this big glass bubble with this guy in the middle with a tassel fern and so on. So that was the story behind them. So they were really successful, and orchids, of course, the rare orchids that we had in there, they flower at specific times during the year, and so we'd chosen the ones that flower in the different months of Expo, and so that they were changed around from time to time. The tassel ferns stayed there the whole time because they don't change seasonally, but the special orchids were changed appropriately once they'd spent their flowers, and we put new ones in. So it was an important part, and just like the timber getters behind you, just an extra piece of interest for people, because they could see and relate to the rainforest in the way that that we wanted them to do that. And I really like the fact that we had the timber getters.
And I think, Lawrie, that little story is just another really great example of the value of these discussion of your papers. And sometimes when we get to the end of it, I sort of realise, we didn't actually talk about the papers all that much, but we've managed to flesh out some amazing material, and whether it be the epiphyte forest and some of the stories behind it, the fact that, you know, in effect they were the first green walls, the toad invasion of the Pacific Lagoon,
Yes.
and now we've got the rigging story of the fountains, and you know, each one of those stories, you know, I had never heard of before, despite 8 years involvement now with the legacy of Expo 88.
Yeah.
So, you know, thank you so much, Lawrie, for participating in all these. You'll actually hear Sir Frank at the end of one of these YouTubes, and his summation of your work is, it's progress, progress, progress.
That's true. And as with all of the various precincts on Expo, what we wanted to do was to create this feeling of having arrived in this World Exposition in another part of the world. And Canada, of course, being very, very different climatically from Brisbane, being a place that's typified by the conifer trees that you can see behind me, and maple, their national floral emblem. Their conifers don't grow in the subtropics. They have their temperate ones, which look similar to the ones behind me, which an Australian tree, and that's our Norfolk Island pine, and also our hoop pine were used as well. And the Canadian maple, the substitute for that was the liquid amber tree. And that gives us the autumn foliage, those wonderful copper tones and red tones that we get with the deciduous foliage on the maple. And so we got that as well. Precinct, as you said, those two primary species that we used to create the Canadian precinct really helped to, you know, to signify that this was Canada, a very different locality to Brisbane. And of course, it was signified by the wonderful totems that they brought, those wonderful sculptural pieces that just were so dramatic. And it was just an amazing place to be. And there's a good story, an interesting story, and a sad story in relation to those totems. The sad story is that Ross McKinnon saved quite a number, and they were a feature of the top lake at the Mount Cootha Botanical Gardens, or now Brisbane Botanic Gardens. And unfortunately, in 2013, they were at their store, and I didn't realise that they were so beyond it. And just after the 25th anniversary, were actually chopped down and wood chipped, which is a great shame, because while the bottom of them were rotten, the top part of it were not, although they had aged and they were fairly nondescript at that stage. But there is another one, which is in the forecourt of the Canadian Embassy in Canberra, and that is still kept in very good condition. And from recollection, it is the one that's in the photo that is now behind me, that one. In amongst these was the human factor series. Now, at this end of the Riverwalk, there are those two beautiful little boys fishing. Now, yes. I don't recall anywhere else in the Canadian precinct other Artbuster pieces, but there may well have been. But it really goes, that photo behind me that will come up now, look at that. I just think that it's spectacular and just shows the great value add that John Underwood's Artbuster pieces put onto the site. And we'll talk about the Artbuster pieces in relation to the UK and the boardwalk as we sort of go through the
the discussions this morning. So I know that you love the Art Buster pieces.
Yes, very much. Yes, they really were the, in some ways, the icing on the cake, because they really linked the story of our Australian culture in so many ways, our working culture, and brought that, not just in cartoons, but because it was really quite an amazing collection of art pieces that that you found as you walked through the site, all related to their particular sites. And that was the important thing, that they weren't just plumped down. They were put in a particular location, like the boys fishing in the Brisbane River, that everybody could relate to, whether you were a boy fishing. As you know, the important part of the Art of Central Australia was that at Expo we wanted to show that the event was a world event being held in Australia, and of course we had to highlight our Indigenous people, our first Australians, and John Truscott was the force behind that, obviously, and so he and I worked very closely together, and he was the sitescape director and I was the landscape director, and so we put our heads together and we thought, right, well, John had amassed this opportunity for the artworks that were on display there. How can we display them to make them truly Australian, a setting that is evocative of the outback, that wonderful red deserts and so on. So I said, right, what we'll do is we'll create a little glimpse of what some of the major elements are of the outback of Australia. The red sands of the deserts, for instance, the walls themselves on which the artworks were placed had that same terracotta finish and so on. And the plant material is very sparse, typical arid land stuff. And and an integral part of that was the rock, special rocks we needed. And behind me there, I've just brought up the photo of one of the human factor sculptors there, sitting on a rock. You can't quite see it there, but John Underwood said to me, he said, look, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to add to the artworks by the human factor in various ways. And I would really like at the main entrance to have a big rock, a beautiful rock that my sculpture can sit on. And he said, but there's one thing, he said, he knew that I was going out west to try and find these rocks, because I knew there's a property just west of Longreach where these incredible rocks were, and special rocks I'll talk about in a moment. But he said, look, what I want you to do is sit on every rock that you look at, cross-legged, just like the sculpture's going to be. And when you find one that's comfortable, that's the one to bring in. So he said, but there's one other thing. He said, you've got to sit on it naked. It was January when I had to go out there, temperatures up in the 40s and things. I didn't do that. I sat on every rock, and finally the one of many that we brought in was there for the entrance. And yeah, the benefit of these rocks are they were special rocks in that they were highly metamorphosed, as they say in geological terms. And if you hit them with a little bit of metal object of some sort, they would ring like a bell, because they were like porcelain. They were polished, and they were just beautiful pieces of sculpture in themselves. And so it was ideal that we used those. And then they were set in, and then we had red sand railed in from out beyond Cunnamulla to surface the whole gallery, the whole outdoor gallery in the red sand. And so the rocks and the sand and the artwork and the plant material, a couple of very big grass trees were there as they were main focal points as well. So that was it, and it was just amazing to be part of that whole process. Yeah, so it's good to think that this was possibly the beginning of the appreciation that we all enjoy today.
Because that art is not only contemporary but ancient, and that's the thing that we need to understand as a community. We have the world's oldest surviving people who are producing contemporary art in the world, and we should be really celebrating that. I think part of the issue too, and looking back at Expo, which is now completing 2 years on, in those days we were culturally naive and immature. We couldn't understand, but in some ways that might have assisted us in doing things that today we probably would have hesitated to do. Sometimes I think we bog ourselves down in protocols, and as a result maybe don't open up enough to see things as we were able to see them at Expo.
I just interrupt there. I think there's a very important little narrative or story. You said that it broke up into a series of islands, and I understand that there was quite a bit of material gotten out of Moreton Bay that made that those islands work. So if you could just give a bit of background on that.
Well, that's important, because what we wanted to do with this precinct, as with all the precincts around the site, was to create a landscape that was appropriate and reminiscent of the nations that are located within it. So in order to do this, many of the Pacific Islands, of course, are coral cays. And so we built these islands, and we needed then to decide, how do we surface that? We want people to be able to walk around, and the islanders built their own huts out of bamboo and palm fronds and so on. Well-made structures, very well-made structures. So in order to give it that real South Pacific feeling of a tropical island, we organised with the government, which was no problem, to open up the coral reefs in Moreton Bay, which were once, decades and decades ago, mined there from the bay and then taken up the Brisbane River, where they were converted into cement, just near Fig Tree Pocket. And so that was all organised. So we re-excavated that area, brought the coral in, pulverised it, and then spread it over all of the island sites, so that when you walk through, you were walking on coral, and that lovely white surface, and just worked so well with the grass huts and the palm huts, and under the canopy of more than 1,000 palm trees. So
were they real palm trees, Lawrie? I mean, real coconut
Yes,
trees?
well, obviously they're not coconut palms, because our climate here in Brisbane is just that much too cold, and winter, they don't like winter. So Expo was over the winter period. So we used Australian palms, the Picabeen palm and the Alexander palm, and placed those. There's more than 1,000 of them. And instead of placing them vertically as they normally grow, the coconut, as everybody knows, grows at all sorts of angles, because under the wind conditions on the islands. So all of the palms that went into the site were placed not vertically, at different angles, and that really enhanced the image of them looking like a South Sea island under the coconut palms.
I think it is very important and very significant for people in Japan to know that we do have these gardens. And I think one of the most important things, Lawrie, about the gardens is that there are Australian plants in the Japanese style. So that's really a true connection. That's really a real, genuine coming together. We're not trying to steal their plants. We're not trying to do something Japanese here. We're doing Australian plants in the Japanese way. In the Japanese way, the whole Japanese culture, their whole style is significant and important to humanity, I think.
It is. Yeah, I agree, Sallyanne. It's an amazing thing what's been done there, the fact that using our Australian native plants there, and because of the way Kenzo Ogata chose them and then managed them, pruned them and whatnot, then they've adopted that character that is so traditional. And that is the magic thing, I think, that you've got this garden that is primarily Australian natives, and it is a wonderful link between the two nations.
It's been absolutely maintained in a pristine fashion. I mean, when I was out there, and people can see the photos of my visit last Sunday, and it is just a tribute to Dale Arvison, the condition. I've never seen it as healthier, and it really looked happy. I mean, I don't know if you could have a happy garden, Lawrie, but it looked very happy.
Yeah, it is.
Of course you have a happy garden, and you have, there are sad and dark and sad, miserable gardens, which perhaps are good for reflection, but a happy garden, which is all about bringing people together. You want to come together in a happy way, not a sad way.
That's right, yeah. And that was the whole story of Expo, wasn't it? What we created there with all those different precincts, it was the happiest place in the world, I think Sir Llew said.
And this, I think, Peter, I think this is why Expo has continued to be significant. One reason, of course, is because of you and the way you have kept it going. But for everybody in Brisbane over a certain age, Expo was a happy moment in time. For the bus drivers of Brisbane, they felt great at the time. Everybody, for the school kids who went after school, for people of my parents' generation who had tea at 5 o'clock and then went to bed, they were actually going out. They discovered that you could eat slightly later and you could eat outdoors. So much about Brisbane changed as a result of Expo. And I think really that happiness, the fact that people felt that happy emotion is very significant now and will continue on.
That was interesting. But probably the most interesting thing is something else that I brought back from Los Angeles, from Hollywood. Just above my head there, you'll see a puff of white spray.
Yep.
That's the water cannon. Now, it's beside the cascade, right beside part of the cascade, in a deep well about the size of a dining room table, and with an edge around that you can sit on. Again, it was sensitised, and so if you sat on the edge of that well, after a few seconds, you'd notice the water, which was calm, start to boil a bit and rumble, and you did have sounds of rumbling coming up through, and the water was starting to boil. Then all of a sudden, a basketball-sized glob of water was cannonised right up into the air, maybe 20 metres or so, and then it would come back down and splash into the cascade. And so that was just another exciting thing that was in that cascade to keep people's interest.
And one ever get hit by that round glob of water as it comes back down?
Actually, there was one. It couldn't have been anything worse, but the Japanese television system were over taking special photos of Expo, and they set up their cameras beside the cascade, and they didn't quite know what to expect, because unfortunately where they set up the camera in the edge of the cascade was right where the water cannon comes down, and right on top of this camera. And there might have been others, but that was the most important one, I suppose, the fact that it it's not wanted, but anyway, it was fun.
That's a great story, Lawrie.
Well, the boardwalk was just below the primary industries, and as you came from the primary industries, there was a very popular route down to the river's edge, and it was very well done. It was and I enjoyed today walking along that river edge, as opposed to walking up in the centre of South Bank.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Matter was also a very strong sculptural piece that was along that whole edge of the Brisbane River, and that's what I remember most fondly from Expo. Sort of making my way home from one of the restaurants or bars and looking at that beautiful scenery that was the river edge at night time after the sun had gone down. Now, to link it back into our more major theme in relation to the Garden Expo or World Garden Expo, again, Lawrie, it was really fulfilling Sir Lew's dictate to you that you have or provide, the world's greenest expo up until that date. And I think that's it's a fundamental that you obviously took to heart.